It was a full weekend. Welcome back. I am Jessica Pettit, and today we are going to be talking about diversity and social justice as starting place. So, I like to tell people at the beginning of this particular talk that I pretty much was kicking and screaming about coming up with a virtual diversity and social justice training because I really thought that it's so important to have the in person conversations. I couldn't figure out how I would ever do the kind of impersonal conversations online. And kicking and screaming, kicking and screaming, kicking and screaming. Finally, about 5 years ago, I had a client who had so many different kinds of shifts working at a children's hospital that there was no way you could just kind of shut the hospital down and get everyone through the training. So I was challenged to do it. So I believe that I have done the almost impossible because I've created a virtual training that instead of kind of hop skipping and jumping over kind of the usual subjects or topics that come up in a diversity training, what I want to do is take one main point and go very deep into one particular piece. So similar to my style from the first webinar, the whole point here is for you to be reflective on yourself and your own life. I feel like the lowest bar possible in my work is asking us to just be responsible for our own lives. Some of us, sometimes that's a hard thing. Like I was telling you this morning, I did not want to get out of bed and I had an obligation, and I was still convincing myself that I didn't want to get out of bed. So being responsible for myself is quite hard. So that is where I'm keeping the bar. So if we kind of start in that location, then literally the starting place is the starting place. If you have any thoughts or comments as you're listening to the recording or going through today, please feel free to send a text message to 202-670-4262. Brandy, I'm going to deputize you again just in case we have any tech issues and people leave and come back or something. You can like scoop them in. That would be great. So, what I wanted to do to focus on this particular training is I want us to be able to focus on how we got to be the way we are without any judgment, but just our life taught us to be this way. But I also think it's important to notice that when we start talking about like the learning outcomes of what we're going to do, that sometimes it is just the act of recognizing that your worldview could be different than somebody else's worldview, and that a problem doesn't have to exist in your life in order for it to be a real problem for someone else. And a problem that someone else is having could actually also be a problem that you are having. That's going to be kind of the piece that I want to go deeper on before we start talking about unconscious bias and some of those other things. It's that particular piece that I think sometimes we skip over and we get to other things. Generally, the assumption, I think, when we start talking about diversity and social justice is that your impact or your responsibility is bigger than yourself. Now, if we start there, then some people are like, nope, I'm out for myself, which is totally fine. And libertarianism is real. Milton Friedman was famous for a number of things. However, for this particular kind of mindset, I think we have to pay attention to what it means to be responsible for someone greater than ourselves. So for some, I think it's a friend of mine told me that in her Muslim faith, the language is the surrounding 40 houses. So there's your house and you're responsible for everything that happens in your house and your yard, sure. But you also have a community or collective responsibility for the surrounding 40 houses. Some people may also be familiar of this kind of 7 generations out. So being connected to a responsibility that is bigger than just the people at your dining room table is kind of a requirement to be able to understand how this approach to these vocabulary words, the evolution of language, and what this really means when we start talking about being responsible. So let's start at the starting place. So this is my friend Julia and her son Jimmy. And what is particularly interesting about this is that if we talk in kind of this theoretical mode about 40 houses surrounding us or 7 generations out, we often also forget that you might not know people who are born 7 generations out. You might have a responsibility or an impact for people that aren't even here yet, or are here yet, but just not in your immediate vicinity. So the starting place is recognizing that kind of collective responsibility and ripple effect. That's a really important thing. By the way, Jimmy is like 16 years old now. So you may hear the vocabulary word come up of the ethnocentrism. So I'm going to talk about some of these words that come up often in this conversation. You may be familiar with some of these, you may not be familiar with some of these. There is no quiz at the end, but I just want to explain kind of like where these words are coming from and why. Because often pinko commie liberals like me jump the gun and start into a conversation, but we haven't even like assessed where people are at or where our conversation starts. So ethnocentrism, the reason why it comes up is that instead of thinking about 40 houses, 7 generations, or now you're thinking about Jimmy, you didn't even know Jimmy existed until now, that it's the idea of putting your own world, your own worldview at the center. And then everything else is kind of extra or circulating around. You make you the sun, your stuff the sun, and then everything else is just kind of circulating around. I use maps as an example of this because depending on where you buy a map, will actually, or where the map is produced, will actually depend what is dead center in the sheet of paper, but then that skews the proportions of everything else. So it's hard to draw a two-dimensional image of something that is a sphere, and I'm not getting into kind of like Newtonian, Galilean philosophical thoughts here, but it's hard to draw a sphere on a sheet of paper to begin with, so it's already skewed a little bit because of just math. But depending on your perspective, you will greatly change what's happening in that map. As a native Texan, I think it is funny that when maps are when maps are born in Texas, that's a very Texan thing to say. Texas is always about a third to an eighth bigger than it actually is because we have some kind of problem with Alaska and California. So I can always tell. Anyways, that's an important thing to remember. You may also hear the terms equity and inclusion. So I use the term equity instead of equality. A lot of people have been using the word equality, but the thing with equality is that equal is not necessarily, we'll talk about this later too, equal is not necessarily what I call the platinum rule, or Tony Alessandra's research came up with the platinum rule. Equity is that everyone has the same opportunity to then take and or personalize that opportunity. So if I said equality is everybody gets shoes, then that means every single person on this call would have a size 11 women's heel. Because if I were to ever wear heels again, I don't even know if I'm ever going to wear socks again, but if I were to wear heels again, you would have to have the same kind of heels that I have, and I wear a size 11. So first off, not everybody wants heels, me included, and number two, not everyone wears size 11. But equality is that everybody gets exactly the same thing. Do you see that? That in itself can be kind of limiting because it's not actually appropriate for what people's actual needs are. So we use the term equity because you have to engage in a conversation that's based on listening to find out what it is that person needs to be included in your kind of equality initiative. So those are really important words to kind of think about. You may also hear the terms dominant identities and subordinated identities. So we like binaries in this world, and so most of us have dominant identities and most of us have subordinated identities, and we didn't pick whether or not they would be privileged or not privileged, if they are frequently silenced or marginalized, either consciously or unconsciously by the privileged or dominant identities in our culture. We didn't pick this, it just kind of worked out that way. It also kind of evolves over time, and some of them stay pretty true. So when I talk about dominant identities, all of you get to really think about what are your dominant identities. Right now, because of COVID and the recession, etc., having a job is a privileged thing that not everybody has right now, right? We could talk about literacy. One of the things I think is the most important, if I could, I would paint every single house in my town just because I think it'd be good for morale. And I would teach every person on the planet how to read because I think it'd be great for the planet if we could all read. So those are dominant privileged skills. Those are dominant privileged situations, but we also have identities that are dominant or privileged. And we have the inverse. and I use the language subordinated or marginalized because they are paired with the dominant identity that may not consciously be silencing or marginalizing the other identity, but because the two exist, that's the dynamic that happens. So hopefully that is a little bit helpful, kind of vocabulary wise. So I'm going to disclose some stuff about myself. You are welcome to play along. You don't have to talk though, don't worry. So for subordinated identities, oftentimes diversity and social justice trainings are generally all around only the subordinated identities. I like to say that this is very good for community development and leads to fantastic t-shirts and bumper stickers. But we organize around our subordinated identities to feel supported, and I think that's great. But one of the things I'd recommend is that when I'm in a community related to my subordinated identities, in those quote safe spaces, I should also be having conversations about my dominant identities and privilege inside of those safe spaces that formed because of our subordinated identities. So, some examples. So, I'll share about me. You can kind of play the home game, literally, and kind of figure out what yours might be and if they are invisible or visible. Sometimes to me, they are invisible, but they are visible to other people. Sometimes to me, they are visible, but they are invisible to someone else. So the difference between invisible and visible is whether or not you have to like proclaim this reality about yourself to someone else, or if it might not even be a reality for you, but other people think it about you. They perceive it to be you, even if it's not true. So, for example, I identify as a lesbian or a queer person. I don't really like the word lesbian, but that's a different workshop. So, I identify as a queer person. Pretty much when I show up, people are like, yep. Sometimes that's my haircut. Sometimes it's because I talk about diversity. Sometimes it's because of my clothing choices. But visibly, people usually assume that I'm not a heterosexual person. I actually was raised in Texas by two atheists, like diehard atheists from very strong Baptist families, which produced two children. My brother is an evangelical Christian, and I'm kind of agnostic. But most people don't know that, and they usually just assume I'm Christian because I don't have some kind of accessory or a practice of some other kind of faith they can observe. So, me identifying as a non Christian is invisible. I do actually have some physical ability limitations. I hate asking people for help, and so you probably will never know about them because I will figure out a way to like charm you into I need to sit in a chair. I identify as a woman. Usually that's pretty visible. Not all the time, but usually it is. My dominant identities, so now we're the privileged ones that kind of subordinate or marginalize some of the other identities in the world. One, I identify as white. That is fairly well known. In the summertime, us very pale vampires, we usually talk about being allergic to the sun, etc., and the sensitivities of what it means to be white. But that does not mean that I don't benefit from white supremacy and own stock in sunscreen. I am a U.S. citizen. That is technically invisible. However, it is usually assumed about me. But it's assumed, and we'll kind of go down the list, it's assumed because I am also very educated and I'm a native English speaker. So then U.S. citizenship kind of magically comes along with that somehow. I am upper middle class. I mean, we'll see how unemployment works out. But as of right now, I am upper middle class. But even though I may be garnering unemployment relatively soon, I still look like or am visibly perceived to be upper middle class. No one's looking at my actual checkbook registry, which I'd recommend. I haven't balanced my checkbook since 1982. I am legally married. That is technically something that you would think isn't visible, except when you pair it with my age and a wedding ring, then people generally assume that I am married. I am over 40. I'm actually almost 50, but no one believes me. I'm assuming eventually they will. I now get ma'amed and asked for directions. That's a very big thing, but my age and the bracket of age vary between being visible and invisible. I am a flaming extrovert that was not genetically predispositioned for social distancing. I think that is becoming more and more and more visible, and why I agree to do webinars like this, because I get to talk with other people. And I'm highly educated, which again goes back to language, my kind of job, etc. So You may also hear concepts, and I've already mentioned a little bit when we start talking about power and privilege. I don't use the word minority or minoritized. For me, those usually bring up kind of math. And I think that that decenters the point of power and privilege when we start talking about what people are referring to when they're saying minority or minoritized. So when we start talking about power and privilege, you don't actually have to outnumber somebody in order to have more power than them. And usually that's actually the inverse of the case. But when we start talking about power and privilege, what we really need to focus on is opportunity, and who has the opportunity to open doors and who has the opportunity to keep doors shut, consciously or unconsciously. So to me, power and privilege is a thing not everyone even like knows that which side of the door they're on, but if you can become more conscious of where you are inside of that opportunity, then you're working with your own power and privilege inside of a conversation. So you can have subordinated identities and be on this side of the door. You can also have dominant identities and be on this side of the door, which is why you have to take place in both conversations at a time. Very few people are 100% only on one side of the door if you take their entire identity and life makeup. Very, very, very few people, at least in the United States. So that's kind of the image that I like to think about when I use the words power and privilege. So when starting to talk about power and privilege, what ends up happening is kind of this like rote, almost habit of like, whoa, well, what about them? Right? Them. And what I think is funny about them is that them exist because us exist. So our us, of course, is always right. That is true. Which makes them right. They're wrong. And them being wrong, it's important to notice that your us is somebody else's them. So we have to dismantle this us and them situation in order to have a conversation about equity and inclusion. But you're correct. Some of them are terribly wrong. That is very true. But what we have in common is that if them is wrong and I could be somebody else's them, then we're all jackasses, literally. Right? We all have to deal with power and privilege. Welcome to the club. So if that is the case, then the great equalizer, in my opinion, is doing the best we can with what we got some of the time. That's important. So the concept that I like to think about or employ here is differently right, which I do not mean moral relativism. I believe there is only one sense of morality for humans. What I mean by differently right is that it is a possibility that somebody is responding to the same subject as you from their lived experience or from their perspectives of conscious or unconsciousness around their own lived experience, and it makes them feel safe and it makes them feel prepared. So that might be different than you and how you're showing up, conscious or unconscious, in the middle of a conversation about your dominant or subordinated identities and how conscious and unconscious you are of your own lived experience, which could also make you show up in a way that you are convinced you are right. But in that moment, you're both potentially showing up at a conversation where you both feel you are right, and that both feeling of right could be different for each other. Because now we're back to like worldview and ethnocentrism. So I think it is an important thing to understand that a lot of really bad diversity trainings will tell you that you are never, ever, ever supposed to make judgments and assumptions. And the reality is I think you're going to make judgments and assumptions. That's going to happen. So if you're going to make them, notice what you're making, and that you're making, your life has taught you that the results of these judgments and assumptions make you feel safe and prepared. And feeling safe and prepared is super important, and you're not going to give that up, even if it's not the right thing to do. But you can be conscious of why does that thing make you feel safe and prepared? And is it accurate? You're going to believe it's right, but is it accurate? So that's an important thing, whether we're talking about de-escalation or we're talking about reaching across difference and having a conversation, or opening up and realizing there's something that you don't know and asking questions to find out the information, is paying attention to what it is that you need to know so that you can delineate the difference between feeling entitled to all of the information and legitimately like allowing someone to accurately exist on the planet. So I like to use this particular concept of when we start talking about how worldview and ethnocentrism doesn't always land well. So, for example, when we talk about the white settlers coming to what is now called the United States, and are generally hundreds of years of failed attempt at genocide, when we start talking about that, what ended up happening was the primarily Western European men leaders, patriarchal society, landed on a piece of earth and found a bunch of people here and said, "Take me to your leader." And if women showed up, they were like, cute, take me to your leader. Cute, take me to your leader, because women weren't respected as leaders. It is also important to mention that when you talk to indigenous communities that are still thriving and alive right now, hence the failed genocide attempt. But when you talk to them and talk about their history and understanding of what treaties are, what it means to have an agreement about the use of land, it is also the case that you can't own land. Ownership doesn't make any sense. So when you make an agreement, you're just making an agreement that you can share. But the concept of sharing did not come with the patriarchy. So it's a very important thing to understand that worldview and ethnocentrism can be used for bad. It can also be used in a really kind of naive way that actually creates a long sordid history of not being able to actually connect with one another, because you're not always available and listening to what is actually happening. The indigenous populations that are left in the United States learned the hard way that their worldview and ethnocentrism, based on sharing that earth is a thing, an actual living creature that you don't own, but that she has the privilege of hosting you. The concept of hosting and sharing is what they had to realize was their worldview. And that wasn't, certainly not, and still isn't, honored. When we think about how we label our expectations, bathrooms are such a great example of this, is there's just some like sticker of an image. According to ADA, all those images are supposed to be the same in every building, and that is not always the case. But I have never walked into a bathroom and actually seen a stick figure or a stick figure wearing a cape. I have not seen this, because there's some kind of like iconography that has meaning in our culture that we just assume everybody knows. But now you're starting to distance from reality, and you're starting to distance from what's actually happening in the space with the people who are actually using the space. We don't share community. We don't share community-based language. We operate from our own dictionary in our own sense of community. And that's where the disconnects and the lack of responsibility for things bigger than yourself can really come from. This is one of my favorite MC Eschers, and it's actually one of my tattoos, but it's just a reminder that you think you know all of the answers, but you don't, right? How many legs does an elephant have? Well, 4, of course. But MC Escher, in this particular case, actually wanted to, the intention is to play with your default answer. So welcome to being wrong. You wrote a story because of course you know the answer, but you're going to have to adjust a little bit and actually pay attention to an optical illusion. And that is the practice. That's the feeling of practicing, of what it means to pay attention to becoming more conscious of what you are unconscious of. So I like to think about responsibility like building blocks, which is very similar to Gandhi's work. But if these are building blocks and this is the starting place, then kind of understanding where you're heading is just as relevant of understanding the habits that got you to where you're starting. Now, I mentioned briefly the golden rule and the platinum rule. The golden rule is present in a lot of different religious and spiritual practices. And basically the fundamentals is that treat everybody the way you want to be treated. Well, this gets to worldview and why golden rule is not enough. So this is my friend Dan. So I told you I grew up in Texas. So Dan's firstborn son, he was in the hospital and literally started talking about how excited he was to take his first son to his first Longhorns game because this was very important. So I know y'all are in North Carolina, so just bear with me. I'm going to be offensive with 2 football teams. But in the state of Texas, you either like the Longhorns or you like Texas A&M. That you have to make this decision pretty much before you can walk. I distinctly remember it being the Oilers and the Cowboys, and I honestly didn't. I lost track of whether or not the Oilers are even still a football team because the answer was the Cowboys. That is how you are raised because football is its own religion in Texas. Now, what is funny to me is that Dan, because he went to the University of Texas and is a loyal Longhorn fan, wrote this entire story about what his son's life was going to be. It was from a place of respect. It was from a place of inclusion and excitement and tradition and all of these things. So of course, Dan's son has since graduated from Texas A&M because that's how the world works, right? So your worldview limits somebody else, but may or may not even be relevant or true. Luckily, Dan is a good father and actually like honored his son's wishes and respects for like what school he was going to go to, so it did not cause a family strife. However, if it's not your firstborn, can you also do this with other people? Can you actually notice your worldview and not apply it to everyone else in such a fierce way, even if it's a total stranger on the street? It is a hard practice to do 100% of the time. So when I say be responsible, what I mean is when is it a little easier for you to do this and when is it a little harder for you to do this? And noticing that about yourself is what it means to notice how your worldview is limiting your connections and relationships with other people. So these are fun pictures of me throughout my entire life. People really like this part of the webinar. But the reason why I think it's important is that how I got here is what I mean by my lived experience, right? So however old I am, wherever I've been, wherever I've lived, whatever I've done, the role I've had in activism, the role I had in starting my own jobs, this is who I am. This is us on our wedding day. We got married in Vegas. Our dogs were our witnesses. When it's very important to understand that all of those moments is just as crucial as to who I am as the evolution of vocabulary. So when I was in school, we started talking about pluralism, right? It's a salad bowl. Then it went to multiculturalism, which was kind of salad bowl with a very heavy gravy. Then we got to tolerance. Nobody wants to just be tolerated. So then we got to awareness, like, oh, okay, I see you. Now let's celebrate. That got too loud for people. So then we switched it to diversity. Now it's social justice. And then really now it's actually equity and inclusion. My lived experience is its own journey, as is the language connected to like being responsible for other people. It's a really, really important thing to understand that instead of somehow thinking that we're fixing a house on fire by changing the words, right? If we need to be more inclusive and we need to be more equitable in our interactions with other living sentient beings on the planet, and I'm just limiting it to living sentient beings, if we can collectively acknowledge that there is a house on fire, and just in case if anyone little hairs on the back of your neck are like, I'm fine, like I don't think there's a house on fire at all. Just a little memo. There is a house on fire. You may not be actually impacted by this house on fire, but for other people who aren't you, there is a house on fire, and it doesn't have to be a problem you experience in order for it to be a real problem. So let me just go ahead and tell you, promise there's a house on fire. So our job is not to be mowing the lawn. If there was a house on fire and you're mowing the lawn, you are not actually addressing the problem of putting the fire out. So even if you were to pick up a garden hose, that may not put the house fire out, but it is the correct activity. And that's why self-reflection and paying attention to your own lived experience and how that's informing your connections or lack thereof and becoming more conscious of the unconscious could be a garden hose, valid, but it is not mowing the lawn. And if we can actually take a stand for what it is that we actually believe in, whatever that is, and be able to speak and share and listen and engage with other people, anger is not a good recruitment tool. Listening and empathy is. So if you can question what you believe in and come right back to it, this is one of the best lessons I ever learned from Mother Teresa, is that sometimes the speaking is actually a self-reflective practice. Why do you believe what you believe? If you can question whatever it is that you believe and you come back to it, you're just going to believe in it that much stronger. Fantastic, but now you're conscious of why you believe what you believe. And that consciousness will help you be able to like have a conversation with other people about why you believe whatever it is you believe and listen to them to find out what it is they believe. That taking a stand and reflecting and speaking and listening and actually engaging in those connections, that is how we will put the fire out. Because that action is more than just picking up a garden hose. It's actually shifting to an understanding that a problem can exist that you don't experience, and you can even be conscious or unconscious of a particular problem. But together, we could do something to dismantle this kind of weird system that I didn't necessarily ask for in the first place. So, I am a big fan of being a weirdo. I encourage all of us to be our own little freak flags. That's great. Remember going to a hair salon? That will be nice someday. It is important to know that I'm not asking for everyone to kind of meld into one particular melting pot of what humanity means. We actually already have. We already have kind of one lived culture that goes with each of the different identities that we hold that we assume everybody else knows about. And we don't. So how can we fly our freak flags, be ourselves, be conscious of what we are unconscious of, and help other people know that we are interested in who they really are? That is ultimately the starting place. If we can do that, then we can very easily do the best we can with what we have some of the time. So I mentioned that it is very, very true that the low bar is being responsible for your own life. That is a really important thing. Doing the best you can with what you got some of the time, I believe, is the least we could do in this wild ride we call this particular life. So to do that, step one is noticing. So you don't have to fix it, right? Like I grew up in white woman school, so we're all about the fixing of the things. You don't have to fix it, you just need to notice. Often we have some practice skills of noticing things from our subordinated, marginalized, or silenced places because we have to notice those things to live. For some people, showing up is already an act of revolution. And you notice those things to feel safe and prepared. Great. Can we employ the same skills to notice power dynamics from our dominant identities? Notice the impact, conscious or unconscious, from our dominant or privileged identities. If we can practice noticing, then we actually get less defensive because we're actually doing a really hard job of noticing the patterns in our lives, noticing who we interrupt and who we don't interrupt, noticing who we listen to and who we do not listen to. If you have an emergency, you have somebody on speed dial to fix every emergency you could possibly think of right now. What commonality do all of your like speed dial people have? When we talk about suppliers or vendors or hiring practices or promotion practices or things like this, it's a really important thing to know and to be conscious of what are those patterns. Not to judge them, you don't have to do that yet, but just notice them. When you have had a bad day and you call the first person that you want to talk to for comfort or support and they're not available, who is number 2? Who is number 3? When I got married in Vegas with about 5 minutes notice, I called both of my best friends first. They don't know which one I called first, right? But in that kind of stack, what commonality do they have? And just being responsible for the pattern of what those people have is something that you need to notice. Not necessarily judge, but notice. I am far more likely when I am really upset about something that's happened in the news or something that's going to happen, I'm far more likely to call a friend that does diversity and social justice work, even if the issue is not diversity and social justice related to some degree. But that's what I want to talk. I want to talk about this, but we already have this assumption at our base. We already know how to like listen to one another. We already know each other's history enough to be able to know what could be showing up here. But that's a very small pie piece of humanity that I could be turning to. But it's just what I do. Well, now I noticed. So that's important. Responsibility is really at the base of showing up into any kind of diversity and social justice conversation. It is also responsible for, we use the word self-care. We also use the word of like spoons, right? Like I don't have any more spoons. But at the base of responsibility is the trust that's you can kind of clock out and take care of yourself and somebody else will do this work. If that is coming from your subordinated and marginalized places, then I believe that is actually self-care. That's actually trust in taking care of yourself. But if you're like, ugh, I'm so exhausted, and that's coming from a dominant identity, then what that is lack of practice, right? Like you're new at this particular sporting event, but you're gonna have to hang in there to build up some muscle memory for this particular conversation. And because it's coming from your dominant and privileged identities, it doesn't cost you actually anything. And that's actually not called exhausted. That's called discomfort. And recognizing the difference between discomfort and exhaustion when you are doing work from your dominant or privileged identities, that's how you can stay in the work and not be burdening other people with your own education. If that exhaustion is coming from your subordinated and marginalized places, that's the difference. I was talking to a white woman the other day, and she was asking me, how do you know the difference between white woman tears and crying due to like actual sadness or mental health related issues or actual exhaustion? Because they can look like this even if they feel like this. And if you have, in this case, she has such depression issues, she's having a hard time recognizing, is she experiencing this or is she experiencing some kind of white fragility and calling it this? And I told her, I said, is it coming from your dominant identities or is it coming from your subordinated identities? And she's like, what does, I don't, I'm too tired. Like, what does that mean? And I said, when you're upset and crying or shutting down, is it your mental health related issues? Are those coming to the fore and becoming the most salient for you, which is different than privileged or dominant and subordinated and marginalized? So your depression is taking over. Can you feel that in you? Or is your whiteness, your cisgenderness, is that reaching back for your depression to say, oh, I can't do this because I have depression? Both of those can look like tears. One of them is an excuse you're making to get off an exercise bike, and the other one is actually a survival mode. But if the only person who knows that answer is you. And so I think that's a very important thing to understand when we're doing work from our dominant identities. Sometimes we will grab everything we possibly can and we'll call it like intersectional or it's multiple identities. But only you know if you are actually coming from your subordinated, marginalized experiences and need to feel safe and need to feel prepared. And I want to honor that as real. And you just have to trust that more people are doing the work. Take care of yourself so you can get back at it. If it's coming from your dominant and privileged identities, just know that that's actually called discomfort, and it doesn't cost anything to be uncomfortable when you magically are privileged inside of a particular system that you may or may not have even asked for. So you have to know the difference, and it's our responsibility to know the difference. So I will email everybody the assessment tool. If you're interested, the point of the assessment tool is to be able to have conversations, not just in your workplaces, but in your own lives and kind of like think and have conversations with yourself. There's no answers on it. It's just some questions to ask yourself. But when you start asking yourself those questions, you'll begin to kind of notice some of those patterns that you may or may not have even noticed beforehand. I'll share, and then I'm going to open it up for the chat questions. I'll check my text. You're welcome to unmute yourself as well. But before Friday's presentation, Brandy sent me an email from, I think it was the president of Duke, and what their statement is. And the body of the email was something to the degree of, we've decided to go ahead with the training, but I wanted you to see this email. And so all of my like Southern roots university administrative work experience like came back before I scrolled down. And I was like, oh God, what has Duke said? Right? And I was like, oh, okay, I'm scrolling. How am I supposed to do a diversity training after the president puts out some terrible, horrible statement? And then I read the statement and it's honoring Black lives. It's honoring Juneteenth. It's recommending it to be a day off. Or a day on of service, like, and I was like, oh, I really I like this statement. This is not going to be hard to follow, right? Like, okay, I will do a training on Juneteenth. Thank you, Duke. But do you see that whole arc that happened? My first reaction was from my history. My first reaction was like, I don't have the bandwidth to do a terrible, horrible training at a terrible. No, what does this statement say? Right? That's my responsibility. So imagine instead of starting at a place of pride that I'm collaborating with Duke, who's honoring Juneteenth, who actually puts out, I know it's just a statement, but it's better than not a statement, but a statement in support of Black Lives Matter, that front and center, to employees, encouraging it as a day off of work. And collectively, the library has decided that, okay, well, in honor of Juneteenth, we're going to still do our first trainings, plus y'all's schedules are a mess. So we're going to do this, okay? That is such a different entry point than had I not noticed how I was entering reading Brandy's email. That's what I mean by responsibility and noticing. Brandy doesn't know anything about my history, right? I'm guarantee you when she sent that email, she wasn't like, oh, this is going to give Jessica agita. That did not happen, right? But it did. And then I took responsibility for it and then was able to engage with something that's actually accurate, not just the story I wrote to feel safe and prepared based on my lived experience. So, with that, feel free to send any texts to 202 670 4262 if there's anything that I can do to help when you're watching the recording or not. I'm going to stop share and see what kind of thoughts or comments or anything that y'all may have had while I was talking. So let's see. I don't have any text yet. That could be a sprint thing. That could be a not texting thing. Let's see what's going on in the chat. If you have anything you want, thoughts or comments you want to say, you can also unmute yourself if you're interested. Oh, Karen's from Texas. Shout out to Texas. Excellent. Oh, in response to my email assumptions that I made, Brandy, first off, you don't have to apologize because how are you supposed to know how my email's going to like impact me, right? And it's my responsibility to notice. And then Beverly's comment that reflection was actually in the description, so then it's actually kind of relevant to Juneteenth, right? So that was all magic. That wasn't intentional. So that worked out great. Okay, I'm curious why you think people really love the pictures of yourself growing up. Does it give them context to help them fill in their stories? I also appreciated the pictures. So here's what's really strange. I have no idea. But when I used to do this training in person. I don't know if y'all recall ever going to a conference, but that used to be my job. So I would do it in person, and where I didn't have the pictures of myself, and I would almost always get a question, usually from a white person, and say, I don't understand what you mean by like your lived experience has made you who you are. And so then I would say, like, whatever it is you've experienced is what I'm calling your lived experience, right? Some like from the first time, we can have a conversation about when is the first time you're able to remember something. That changes and varies for people based on their lived experience, and how you got to be standing in front of me today. All that stuff in the middle, that is the best tool you have to do diversity and social justice work. It's not external to you. It's not even a result from this training, right? Like it's you've got way more tenure with yourself than you do with me for an hour. And I would always get that question. So then, kind of sarcastically, I added in a bunch of pictures of myself, honestly, because the conference that I was doing this at was having a theme about like crucible moments is the language I use in my book. So it was crucible moments in their profession. So then I added pictures to kind of go along with all the pictures that were at the place. And it was the first time that people coming from their dominant identities, like understood by like life journey or life experience. So I didn't get that question, and I could get to another level of questions. So when I turned this into a virtual event, I just kept them in there. Plus, I think there's like especially in a series. Um, who is this trainer person? Either as a white person doing diversity training or like a mandated training, and you're like, how many hours do I got to do this? Like at least you get to know me a little bit more. So I think that that helps some of that connection. I think it feels vulnerable but interesting for people to have a PowerPoint slide of me growing up. It's also on a meta level, there are things that happen to me I don't have photographs of that were crucible moments. There are also things of me that were happening and I do have pictures of, and there is no way in hell I would ever put them in a PowerPoint. Because, like, what if someone asked, like, who's that guy in the red shirt? And I'm like, oh, he's in prison now. Right? Like, I get to pick and choose what to put in my own things. So hopefully that's helpful. Um,
Jess, thank you for the session today.
oh, absolutely.
Two points that I'm glad you brought out. One was the equity versus equality,
Mm-hmm.
because people I think sometimes do get those things confused. But that nice little graphic with the guy standing in front of the baseball field, with the up and the down, the short. I think that's a good illustration of the equity versus equality. And the other thing is, um, I can't remember what the other thing was that I was going to say. It was another thing that I was going to say, point out, but it just went straight out of my head. Maybe it'll come back in just a
All right.
minute.
Feel free to jump in anytime.
Oh, I
So
know what it was.
there
It
you go.
was it was the fact of you. Well, it's cultural taxation, but you described it as exhaustion.
Mm-hmm.
When you're actually in this area and doing a lot of stuff, which is always try to encourage people to continue to do that, because when they're in those situations, if they don't do it, who's going to do it? I mean, you feel like you do build that memory though after a while, that muscle memory, as you were talking about, and it gets easier to do. But some of the newer librarians that are going into the field, librarians of color, get really tired really quickly, and just get really exhausted and just want to just bail out. But I try to encourage them to kind of do what you say, try to kind of build that muscle memory, because we need them. If not them, who? If they're
Mm-hmm.
not there, but I can understand the cultural taxation of doing that over and over again.
Yeah,
Definitely.
it's a really great term you're using, the cultural taxation, and the kind of how I would define that term, and Beverly, feel free to nudge my definition. How I would define that is the stuff that it takes for you to literally show up that only someone who has your same experience could potentially understand. So
Absolutely.
it is a problem that is shared by other people, but certainly not everybody. And sometimes it's even communicated without words, right? And Beverly, what I think you bring up that I think is really key to understand is that depending on the context and the muscle memory, then you can get almost calloused in a certain way so you can handle it, right? So I have been a lesbian married to a trans man for over 15 years. So when someone, if I disclose that information, somebody is like, what was that middle thing? What's going right? So like represent trans partners everywhere. Like you can ask me whatever questions you want to. I will move it. It's almost like a jukebox, right? Like yes, so I met my husband. I identify as a lesbian. My husband met me right before he was transitioning. I identified him as a man. He was beginning to transition as a man. He thinks that's the funniest part of the story because I gave him trans woman resources instead of trans man resources. I have rarely been attracted to men, but certainly was attracted to him. And I broke up with my girlfriend at that time, and we have now been married for 15 years. It might be weird for you, but imagine how weird it is for us to have a straight guy married to a lesbian, right? Like that, I have said that 5 million times. So I can say it, it's cute, it's charming, it's disarming, it has enough information in it. I've practiced how to say that. So that's no longer getting into me, right? That's a jukebox. That's E7. I've had this question before. There are other questions that I might be unprepared for or just in that moment I cannot do. So E7 is currently temporarily unavailable. So I just want to put that out because that's what your allies and advocates are for, is that being able to understand what that means and what your intention is. So you're not like, she's married to a trans man. Sit here and let me tell you what that means. That's gossip. It's very different, right? So being able to understand what you need as a survival mode, but also being reflective of where you're not interested in going because of survival mode, and that can also ebb and flow and change. That's a really important piece. The term muscle memory, I think, can also be problematized, right? So when I do a lot of work with police enforcement, and what's fascinating about literal muscle memory is that when two police officers are doing a training about taking a gun away from a bad person, right? Like, so they'll stand like this. One person is the bad person with the gun, and then the other police officer has to take the gun and put it back, right? So then what ends up happening in the training is they do it over and over and over again. So let's take Russell, because you're top center in my screen. So you don't have to do anything. Don't worry. Just be there. So Russell and I are partners. So I am the police officer in this case. Russell is the bad guy in this case. So Russell points a gun at me. So then part of the training, there you go, is I take the gun and I have taken it away from him, right? So then the way that this works is I then hand the gun back to Russell and we do it again. And practice, 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 practice. So while that was mainstream training for a very long time, one of the number one ways police officers were being shot and killed was that they handed the gun back to the bad person. Because of the muscle memory, Russell and I have to do this for an hour. So then in the heat of the moment, right, literally the heat of the moment, Russell actually is a bad person with a gun pointed at me. Then I take the gun and then I hand it back to him and then I got shot. So they had to change training. And I think it's a very powerful metaphor because it is very important to understand that we have the similar training. We have the similar habitual things that we do, and it can actually go really bad if we're not in check with our muscle memory. So we have to literally be mindful of what we are doing as self-protection and what we are doing that is actually going to create a problem if we are not being careful, because our bad training habits could actually come back to get us. Both are true at the same time. So there was another thing I was going to mention. Oh, Beverly, I'm also trying to read the chats. The other thing Beverly mentioned is a visual. Some of you may see it, and there's like 100 iterations of it now, of 3 different people who are different heights standing at fences with different boxes doing different things to look over the fence at the baseball game. So the reason why I don't use that image in my own work is because it is an excellent example of how academics go wrong. So when we start talking about dismantling oppression, everybody should be able to just be at the baseball game. So then having access to the right height of a box to look over the fence is now gets academicized as to who put the boxes there. What if your box is falling down? What if I don't want to stand on a box? What if I prefer to sit down? I don't want to be like, you're like, shut up, academics. Like, can you just look at the cartoon for like what it is? It's a fun Wikipedia page if you want to read, because the original artist actually had a completely different intention, which was making fun of academics. And then academics missed the joke, because that's what we do, and turned into this whole big thing. So now there's like 10 different kinds of images of what it would take to get 3 people to watch a baseball game. I don't like baseball. So that's fun. Okay. 4 minutes, I think, right? Where we go, matched. Appreciate. Thanks. About the pictures. What is fascinating, I do think another thing about the pictures is that 2 things. Number one is that we are able to engage in conversations about things that happened in the past and then somehow or another are way less defensive about them. I think because they went through our own editing process and we allowed this picture to go forward. So it's like a catalog of safe stories, right? And now you're like, okay, I don't really know how to talk to Megan. And like Megan and I had this really big fight at the last staff meeting, but like your Throwback Thursday picture, like I used to have that bike. Let's talk about our bikes, right? So then we are able to talk out of context in a way that then like what usually ends up happening is one person is like, oh, okay, we're all better now. And sometimes the other person is like, I bet they think we're all better now. But nope, I didn't forget that staff meeting, but I'm glad you had good choice in bikes, right? So you can stay starfy or you can think it fixes it. So you still need to actually check in about what your connection is, but it's at least like the beginning of like a rope bridge to another conversation. I think that's helpful. I also believe that we are actually all still children. Just some of us got taller And so, like, recognizing where people came from fills in the story we wrote about you to begin with. So then that doesn't make us more accurate. It just makes our story deeper, and it could potentially still be wrong. I think that that helps, though. I do this for orientations. I'll show them old pics of me that kind of show the parts and pieces of my life and a bit about me. They like it, and I've made some connections with students on either music, biking, military, etc. Right. It's also a really great way that, like, we use the word tokenization is almost always having a negative meaning. But if summarize your life in a slideshow with 10 pictures, go Virginia, right? Like, if you do that, you have to pick, like, don't actually worry. She just made a face like, no. But you have to, like, quickly pick 10 safe things that create an arc that make it a good show. But then you also, like, want to connect with certain people that might feel otherwise marginalized or something in the audience, right? So then that's how you tokenize your own life to connect with other people that you're potentially tokenizing. And then you find out that a left-handed veteran didn't see themselves in your slideshow, and you're like, oh, I had the right picture. Like, that's how tokenization also works. Um, the house on fire. Metaphorically, will the fire be put out? Will it burn the house and die? Is it fueled forever? That is a really great question, Eugene. And to be completely honest, I somehow have managed to mostly be optimistic. The things that seem to crush my optimism more than anything for some reason are school shootings. It takes me a very long time to get out of a bucket of sadness about school shootings. Or, like, my niece, when she had to shelter in place and couldn't go to school anymore, the very first thing she said is, oh, we don't have to, we're going to miss the shooter training. Because the first day that they didn't have to go to school was their, like, mandated Monday or monthly shooter training at school. I can't handle that. It takes a very long time for me to find my, like, optimistic unicorn again after that. But that also makes sense with all of my privileged identities, that that's the thing, and that school shootings, like, connected me to my niece in a way that my niece didn't even mean. I believe that the house fire is fueled forever. I also believe that we are far more powerful than the fuel of the house fire. It just depends on what we choose to do. The scariest part of that belief is the attention span of a human community. So my job is to nurture the human community so that we can stay focused and start doing something. But I do believe that systems of oppression are set up to last forever, and it's up to us to do something different. But we are far more powerful than any campfire. It's the smoke and mirror of what power and privilege are, the systems that support power and privilege. It's all made up. So I don't believe that there is a physical dismantling other than the mental story that's in all of our heads. And I believe the mental story that is in our heads is in our heads because it makes people feel safe and prepared. So if this is a very Buddhist concept, but if we do what we can to make ourselves and our people, and even just one person who is not our people, just one, don't go crazy, your people and one person, if we can do something to help them feel safe and prepared in a way that does not rely on that old story, they have time and space to change the story. And so, like, the evolution of belief, the evolution of thought, the evolution of who deserves equity is dependent on those fertile moments of preparation and safety feelings so that they can exhale and change their mind. And by they, I mean you, because you're my they, right? So what can I do to encourage myself to feel safe and prepared outside of a story that currently makes me feel safe and prepared? And if I can do that, then I might be able to role model that for someone else. That's literally why I do my work. And I believe it is working, and I believe it takes more people. So, thank you for coming to my TED Talk. There's a lot of other chats, and I can stay for a couple more minutes, but I just want to do another vocal check-in to see if there's anything or any thoughts or comments that I can get to. I don't have any texts. Just knocked over my coffee. Nothing against Longhorns, but the Tar Heel Horns, enough said. And as far as A&M Aggies go, AT Aggies, enough said. Laugh out loud. My mother was Aggie and my dad was a Longhorn, so I went out of state to college because it's not worth it. Um, that's why I asked for high school pick or older. Laugh out loud. Maybe we should do this. Laugh out loud. Different world I learned at the Living While Black at Duke was Pessy optimistic. Oh, that's fun. Eduardo Bonilla Silva mentioned it. I missed that.
Yes, he's one of the instructors here at Duke, one of the faculty members here.
Awesome.
That's his new term. It's Pessy. So I'm putting Pessy in front of everything.
That's
Pessy
great.
hope, Pessy optimistic, Pessy everything.
As soon as we get off this, I'm telling my husband because he's all kinds of like pessy dishwasher. It's true. Yeah, he doesn't have to cook, but he has to do the dishes, and I'm a pessy cook. Okay. Um, don't start nothing, won't be nothing. Oh, feel free, start away.
That's for Randy specifically.
Thank you,
Oh,
Jess.
you're welcome. Virginia, you were going to say something, but you're muted. Just kidding. Okay.
Eagles gonna
Um,
always hate.
I'm sorry.
The Eagles are always gonna hate. That's for Beverly.
I am noticing some dynamics within this group. Um,
Eagles fly high.
okay. I am all
Lord
about this
drive
pride
mercy.
business. I am really glad I decided to get out of bed and put on adult clothing. And I will see you. When is our next one?
Friday.
Friday, which in COVID time will be in 4 minutes. So I will see you
Or
then.
400 years. Who knows?
I don't have children, so it seems to be
Oh,
like this. Yeah, that seems to be the big difference. Okay. Bye y'all. See you on Friday. Happy Monday.
thank you.
Bye,
All right.
whackers. We're meeting in the room.
Okay.